The road of death in Bataan. They say war makes men out of boys, but I think war just takes boys and turns them into ghosts. If you were there, if you walked that road under the weight of an unyielding sun, with your feet sinking into the hot, dead earth, you would understand. The Bataan Death March, those words mean nothing to someone who wasn't there. To them, it's a chapter in a history book, a black and white photo of skeletal men with hollow eyes, a tragedy to be acknowledged but never truly felt. To me, it was a slow execution, stretched over miles, over days, over thirst, over the moments when hope was just a whisper in the wind. I remember the moment we surrendered. It was early April, the year was 1942, and we had fought until there was nothing left. No food, no bullets, no strength, just the sickness in our bodies and the weight of inevitability. The Japanese had us surrounded, their bayonets gleaming under the cruel Philippine sun. General King made the call, and thousands of us, Americans and Filipinos, laid down our arms. That was the moment we stopped being soldiers. We were something else now. Something less. The first few hours after the surrender were surreal. There was relief, sure, a momentary lull in the terror of battle, but that quickly faded when we saw the way they looked at us. We weren't prisoners of war in their eyes. We were filth, disgrace, dishonor. We had surrendered, and to them, that was worse than death. It wasn't long before they started moving us, and the rumors started spreading. Some whispered that we were being taken to a camp, others said we were to be executed in groups, and others still said nothing, just walked, eyes fixed on the ground. Then the march began. The first day was the easiest, though that's a hell of a thing to say about a journey through hell. The sun burned down on us, turning the sweat on our backs into salt. We walked in lines, shoulder to shoulder, but the formations were loose. The Japanese guards, dressed in their khaki uniforms, carried their rifles lazily, swinging them like canes as they walked alongside us. At first, they only struck men who stumbled, who slowed down. But as the hours stretched on, they started doing it for sport. A man beside me, his name was Carter, from Ohio, staggered slightly, just enough for his knee to buckle. The nearest guard didn't hesitate. He swung his rifle but into Carter's stomach, so hard the man doubled over and collapsed. The guard laughed, then stepped on Carter's hand, twisting his boot into the dirt before moving on. Carter didn't get up. That was the first time I realized that slowing down wasn't an option. Then came the thirst. We hadn't had proper rations in days before the surrender, and the Japanese made sure we had none now. No water, no food, just the road and the heat. Some men broke early. I saw one, God, I wish I didn't remember his face, drop to his knees in the dust and start licking at the ground, trying to pull moisture from the earth itself. The guard closest to him didn't even stop walking, just raised his rifle, pulled the trigger, and let the man crumple into the dirt. That was when I stopped looking at the bodies. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the line of prisoners stretched as far as the eye could see in both directions. We had walked for hours, maybe a day, maybe more. Time was nothing but pain and dry throats, and the sound of boots against dirt. Some men whispered to each other, others just walked, their eyes dead already. And then the real horror started. At night they made us stop, but there was no rest, no sleep. The Japanese herded us into tight groups, so close we could barely move. They stood over us, bayonets ready, ensuring no one escaped. Some men collapsed from exhaustion, but if they didn't get up fast enough, they were dragged away, their fate unknown. I kept my eyes forward. I didn't speak, and that was when I saw the well. A few yards away, half hidden behind a crumbling stone wall, was a well. A real deep well. My tongue was swollen from thirst, my lips cracked and bleeding. I wasn't the only one who saw it. A Filipino soldier a few steps ahead of me turned his head slightly, just enough to let me know he saw it too. Then he ran. It was a stupid thing to do. We all knew it. But thirst makes men mad. He bolted toward the well, his feet kicking up dust, his body little more than a shadow in the moonlight. He never made it. A guard shot him in the back before he took his third step. He fell forward, arms outstretched, fingers grazing the stones of the well's edge before going still. No one else tried. That was the first night. And in the silence that followed, as the moans of the dying faded into the whisper of the wind, I realized something. We weren't prisoners. We were already dead. Morning came with a suffocating heat that wrapped around us like a second skin, sinking deep into our bones, pulling at the last reserves of energy we had left. My mouth was a desert, my throat raw from the dry air and dust that had settled overnight. My body ached in places I didn't know could ache, my feet nothing more than torn flesh inside my boots, but I forced myself up because not getting up meant death. It wasn't a thought or a decision, just a fact, as certain as the sun rising above the blood-stained road ahead. The Japanese guards wasted no time. They shouted at us in their sharp, clipped language, prodding the slowest with their rifle butts, their impatience growing with every passing moment. Some men were too weak to move, their bodies like sacks of bones sprawled out in the dirt, eyes wide but unfocused, lips cracked open in silent pleas for mercy. There was none. No second chances. The ones who didn't stand were dragged away, their limbs limp, their fates sealed the moment their strength failed them. A single shot would ring out seconds later, marking the end of another life, and the march would continue, as if nothing had happened, as if that man had never existed at all. The road stretched on forever, a never-ending path of agony lined with corpses and memories I wished I could forget. The sun climbed higher, turning our march into a slow crawl of suffering, the heat rising from the ground in shimmering waves, distorting the horizon into something that looked almost unreal. The jungle flanked us on either side, lush and green, alive with the sounds of birds and insects, mocking us with its abundance, its hidden rivers and shade just out of reach, so close yet so impossible to reach. Some men tried. I remember one in particular, Sullivan, I think his name was, though it hardly mattered anymore. He had been ahead of me for most of the march, a tall man with broad shoulders that had once carried a rifle with pride, but now sagged under the weight of exhaustion. I watched him turn his head slightly, eyes scanning the jungle, his fingers twitching at his sides as if he were weighing his chances, trying to decide whether a desperate sprint into the trees was worth the risk. And then, without a word, without hesitation, he broke into a run. For a second, just one, I thought he might make it. His feet pounded against the dirt, his arms pumping as he pushed forward, his body leaning toward the promise of salvation beyond the tree line. But the Japanese were faster. They didn't shoot him right away. They wanted to make an example of him. A guard barked an order, and 3 others took off after him, their strides effortless compared to his, their faces unreadable beneath the brims of their helmets. I kept walking, eyes forward, pretending not to see, pretending not to hear the struggle, the shouts, the dull thuds of rifle but slamming into flesh and bone. When the sound stopped, I knew what had happened. When I finally dared to glance sideways, Sullivan was being dragged back onto the road, his face unrecognizable, blood pooling from a deep gash above his temple. They dumped him like garbage at the side of the march, leaving him there to die slowly, his breath rattling, his body twitching in protest against the inevitable. No one stopped to help. No one could. We just kept walking. Hours passed. Maybe days. Time was meaningless now. Nothing more than a cruel joke played by the universe, stretching every second into an eternity of suffering. The only thing that mattered was water, that elusive, unattainable miracle that we dreamed about with every step we took. The thirst was worse than the hunger. Hunger gnawed at your stomach, an ache that could be endured, ignored if you focused hard enough. But thirst, it was a demon that lived in your throat, clawing at your insides, whispering promises of relief that would never come. Men went mad from it. I saw one, Peters maybe, or was it Johnson? Names blurred together now, just echoes of men who no longer existed. He was stumbling ahead of me, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his eyes wild with desperation. He had been whispering to himself for hours, muttering about water, about rivers, about how the Japanese couldn't possibly deny us forever. And then he saw it, a puddle, barely more than a patch of mud in a shallow dip in the road, a remnant of rain long since evaporated. It wasn't clean. It wasn't deep. But it was wet, and that was all that mattered. He dropped to his knees, scooping handfuls of the filth into his mouth, gulping it down as if it were the sweetest nectar on earth. The shot came before he had even swallowed his second handful. His body jerked, stiffened, then crumpled forward, his face landing in the very water he had been so desperate to drink. The guard who shot him barely spared a glance before slinging his rifle over his shoulder. His job done, his message clear. The rest of us walked around a body, our eyes averted, our thirst growing stronger, more unbearable with every step. The worst part was knowing there was no end to it. Even if we survived the march, we knew what awaited us. The prison camps. The disease-ridden, overcrowded hellholes where death was a certainty, where survival was just another kind of suffering. But none of that mattered right now. The only thing that mattered was taking the next step, and then the next, and then the next. By nightfall, the air had cooled, but it brought no relief. The exhaustion was too deep, the pain too overwhelming. They let us stop again, forcing us into another tight formation, our bodies pressed together in a desperate attempt to find space to breathe. Sleep was impossible, but some men tried. Others simply stared at the sky, their minds already somewhere else, already gone. That was when I noticed something strange. Not far from where I stood, there was a man, an older Filipino, his face lined with the kind of wisdom that only comes from surviving things no man should ever endure. He was different from the rest of us. While we trembled, while we suffered, he simply sat, his back straight, his eyes calm. He was whispering something, his lips moving in a steady rhythm, his breath even despite the horror surrounding him. I strained to hear, but the words were too soft, too distant. Then, as if sensing my gaze, he turned his head slightly and met my eyes. And he smiled. It wasn't a smile of madness or delusion. It wasn't the grin of a man who had lost his mind. It was something else, something unsettling, something that made my skin prickle with unease. He nodded once, slow and deliberate, before closing his eyes again, his whispering resuming, a soft chant against the night. And for the first time since the march began, I felt something other than pain, something other than thirst. I felt afraid. Fear is a strange thing. It can creep up on you slowly, like a shadow stretching in the late afternoon sun, or it can hit you all at once, like the crack of a rifle shot in the dark. That night, as I watched the old Filipino man whisper to himself, his lips moving in slow, deliberate rhythm, his face calm against the chaos around him, I felt it seep into my bones like cold water. I had seen men die in every way imaginable, starvation, exhaustion, execution, but this was different. This wasn't just the slow decay of life slipping away. This was something else entirely. The march continued at dawn. No food, no water, no mercy. We had lost count of the days, lost all sense of time. Some men stopped speaking entirely. Their voices dried up along with their strength. Others began to hallucinate, mumbling about home, about wives and children and meals that didn't exist. The ones who still had something left in them tried to help the weaker ones, but the Japanese made it clear, if you slowed down to help another man, you were as good as dead. I saw one soldier, a young kid barely out of his teens, try to lift his fallen friend onto his shoulders. He didn't get far before a guard cracked his skull open with the butt of a rifle. His friend, too weak to stand, didn't even flinch when they shot him seconds later. The bodies lined the road now. Some curled up as if they had simply gone to sleep. Others twisted into grotesque shapes, their final moments frozen in agony. The smell was thick in the air, a mix of sweat, rot, and blood, so strong it coated the inside of my mouth, mingling with the taste of thirst. It became impossible to tell who was still alive and who was merely waiting to die. And through it all, the old man kept walking. I don't know why I kept watching him. Maybe it was the way he moved, steady, deliberate, like he knew something we didn't. Maybe it was the way the guards ignored him, their eyes passing over him as if he were invisible. Or maybe it was just that damn smile, that quiet, knowing grin that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Then something happened. Something I still can't explain. A man ahead of us collapsed, face first into the dirt. It wasn't unusual. Men were falling every few minutes now. But this time, the guard didn't react. No rifle, but no gunshot. Nothing. He just stood there watching, his grip on his weapon tightening slightly. The other guards noticed, too. For the first time since the march began, they hesitated. And then the old man stopped. He knelt beside the fallen prisoner, placing one wrinkled hand on the man's chest. The whispers started again, low and steady, like a prayer or a song only he could hear. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound of it sent a chill through me, cutting through the heat like a blade of ice. The fallen man opened his eyes. It wasn't possible. I knew that. We all knew that. He had been dead. He had to be dead. No one who collapsed like that ever got back up. But there he was, his breath coming in slow, measured gasps, his fingers twitching against the dirt. He looked at the old man, confusion flickering in his sunken eyes, and then somehow he stood. The guards stepped back. I saw one of them mutter something under his breath, gripping the stock of his rifle like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. The old man just smiled again, his whispering growing softer, fainter, until it was lost in the shuffle of tired feet against the dirt. No one spoke. No one dared. We kept walking. The sun burned high overhead, casting long shadows over the road, stretching the bodies behind us into dark, twisted silhouettes. The jungle watched from either side, indifferent to our suffering, the thick green leaves hiding creatures that were better off unseen. But I didn't look at the jungle. I didn't look at the road. I looked at the old man. I tried to make sense of it. Maybe the fallen soldier had just passed out, not dead at all. Maybe he had been on the brink, but the old man's touch had jolted something in him, willed him back to life. Maybe it was just luck, just coincidence, just something my mind twisted into a miracle because I needed to believe in something, anything to survive. But then it happened again. Another man fell. Another man should have died. And yet, when the old man whispered, when he placed his hand over their chest, they stood. Not all of them. Not the ones who were too far gone. Some never moved again, their souls already too distant to be called back. But enough. Enough for the fear to settle into the hearts of the guards, for them to start murmuring among themselves, shifting uneasily as if they were the prisoners now, trapped in something they couldn't understand. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The old man slowed his pace. His breathing grew shallow. His shoulders slumped. And without a sound, without a moment of warning, he fell. No one moved. Not the prisoners. Not the guards. We just stared, waiting, expecting him to do what the others had done, to rise again, to shake the dust from his skin and keep walking, like nothing had happened. But he didn't. The whispering was gone. The smile was gone. He was gone. The guards didn't know what to do. They stood over him, their faces unreadable, their bodies stiff with something that looked an awful lot like fear. One of them raised his rifle, as if to put a bullet in the old man's skull, just to be sure. But another grabbed his arm, shaking his head. I couldn't understand the words they exchanged, but I understood the meaning. They were afraid to touch him. And then the order came. Move. We walked past him, leaving his body in the dust like all the others. But this time, something was different. This time, the march didn't feel the same. The weight of death was still there, the hunger, the thirst, the exhaustion. But something had shifted, something unseen, something we didn't have a name for. I kept walking, my eyes forward, my feet dragging against the dirt, but I knew that the old man had changed something. I survived the march. I made it to the prison camp, where the suffering continued, where more men died, where the war dragged on like a never-ending nightmare. But I never forgot him. And sometimes, even now, when the night is quiet and the air is thick with the smell of rain, I swear I can still hear his whisper. Soft, steady, unbroken, calling someone back from the edge.